Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Liba Wenig-Rubenstein, Director of the Aspen Institute's Business Roundtable on Organized Labor, and today marks the public debut of our roundtable, which is a private network of CEOs, founders, investors, and other senior business leaders at admired companies. And we're here because we think that the American economy is failing too many workers, and that when it fails workers, it also threatens the businesses that employ them and the fabric of society that binds them. That's something that will be hard to fix without a community of business leaders ready to do things differently. Our roundtable is building such a community. Our members want to chart a new course in their relationship with organized and organizing workers, and they want to invest in other mechanisms that offer workers agency over the terms and conditions of their work. Our members are in a diverse range of industries: construction, hospitality, food, media, sports, finance, technology. Whether they have 100 employees or 150,000, whether their revenues are 100 million or 30 billion, these leaders share the belief that respect for and partnership with their workers can be a critical step, perhaps a necessary step, toward business success and shared prosperity. You'll hear from 3 of these companies today. Our members know that workers increasingly expect a voice in decision-making, that the public increasingly demands that businesses treat employees fairly, and that worker discontent fuels increasing political polarization. In coffee shops, writers' rooms, warehouses, factories, gaming studios, retail stores, workers are organizing for change. They're driven by a confluence of factors, including the pandemic and inflation, new technology, rising executive pay, and a tighter labor market. But after decades in which labor's influence waned in the United States, many of today's business leaders simply lack experience with any form of organized labor. They follow the conventional wisdom that worker voice is something to be minimized or controlled. They are unaware that collaborative approaches exist. Our roundtable cultivates and organizes those business leaders ready for change and doing things differently. We provide a space for leaders to come together, to learn, share, and make progress on strategies that offer workers a meaningful seat at the table. Since February of last year, we've hosted 17 off-the-record sessions with our members, and today we're excited to welcome you all into a compressed version of that conversation, reimagining the business labor playbook for the 21st century. This roundtable is a collaboration between Aspen's Economic Opportunities Program and the Institute for Work and Employment Research at MIT's Sloan School of Business. We started it at the encouragement of American labor leaders, and we continue to benefit from their input, including AFL-CIO President Liz Schuler, who is here with us today. We are also deeply grateful for the support of our early funders, the Omidyar Network, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the Families and Workers Fund. Now, a few quick technical notes. All attendees are muted, but we welcome your questions at any time using the dedicated Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have other types of comments or links you want to share, please put those in the chat. If you're posting about this conversation publicly, please use Aspen's hashtag #TalkOpportunity. We are recording the event and we'll share it out after. Closed captions can be activated by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And finally, whenever you leave the Zoom, we would be very grateful if you take the quick survey that pops up. Now, I would like to introduce our closest thought partner, Professor Thomas Kochen from MIT. Tom is a leading scholar on industrial relations and work, and along with former National Labor Relations Board Chair Wilma Liebman, Tom facilitates pretty much all of our roundtable sessions. Tom, thank you so much for being here and for kicking off our first segment.
Well, thank you, Liba, and especially a big thank you to you for all the good work you and your team are doing to make this Aspen and MIT roundtable work so effectively and move forward. And I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this session on reimagining how we can work together to shape the future of work. Our MIT Institute for Work and Employment Research is pleased to be a co-sponsor because we have a long history in working on these issues to bring labor and management together for constructive conversations and actions. And this is right squarely within this tradition and addresses many of the issues that we're working on today. The roundtable today comes at a pivotal point in labor management relations. As Liba has already said, workers are expressing an increased and a broader set of expectations for having a voice at work on issues that will help them close the voice gap that many of them experience, not only on wages and working conditions, but on the values of the firm, on new technologies, on diversity and inclusion, and how we can all work more effectively together. And unions are organizing in new ways and in large numbers and representing workers in innovative ways, more powerful ways to be sure. And a growing number of business leaders are searching, as well, as Leva said, to find more responsible and effective ways of responding to all of the changes that are going on. So the discussions that we'll have today will help advance these efforts and demonstrate their value. But my job here is simply to introduce our first two speakers, and I can't think of two people better equipped to kick this off. Let me first welcome my good friend Liz Schuler. Liz is the president of America's largest labor federation, the AFL-CIO, and she's not only the first female president of the federation, she is really on the forefront of encouraging and leading all of the innovations that labor needs to introduce and to foster in order to be a visible, powerful, and effective partner in public policy issues and in labor management relations, working with business and working with the next generation workforce. I look forward to hearing more about some of the fruits of her leadership, particularly as we enter this changing world where technology is shaping so much, but has so much to learn from the workforce itself, and where unions are playing such a constructive role in many aspects of our society. And Liz will be joined by also my good friend and colleague, Roy Bahat. And I've said to many, and I'm going to say it again here, that Roy is the most innovative, the most energetic, and the most knowledgeable business leader playing a leadership role in labor management relations in our country today. Over the past several years, I've watched as he's crisscrossed this country and has met and engaged union leaders and business leaders and academics in this field to learn more about what the possibilities might be for the future. And he's now putting all of that to work to help create that future for all of us. He's a unique, very unique and valued partner and leader in moving this dialogue forward. So Roy and Liz, take it from here.
Thank you, Tom. You knocked me off my game. I'm going to blush and get distracted. All right, but I want to jump right in because we have limited time with Liz. And because I feel like we know each other, I'm going to start out really blunt, which is, I know you've been fighting the boss on some level for a long time. You were a babysitter who discovered you and your friend were paid different amounts and got equal pay. And so the first question is, why would the leader of the biggest federation of unions in the US come and talk about building a healthy relationship between business and labor? Isn't kind of the job to fight the employer tooth and nail to get the best deal for workers? Would just love to hear how you think about it.
The answer is yes, and I first of all want to thank you, Roy. Echo Tom's comments. You've been a great partner, and this is the place we explore how we can do things differently. So that's why I wanted to be here. Is we have so much instability in our country, whether it's economic, geopolitical, race and economic issues driving change. We have big threats like climate and technology. And we have to have more dialogue with each other, no matter if we disagree, to provide space like this to forge solutions, because this is our country. We are all in this together. So that's why I wanted to be here. And yes, we can fight very effectively. We can stop traffic any day of the week, but we can also, be solutions driven. We can, when workers find their voice and are respected and included as trusted partners with their management counterparts, we can actually make you more money. We are more productive and more loyal, frankly. So there is a business case for unionism. And so I wanted, I think Liba said it in the beginning, more leaders in the business world to know often there's this perception or stereotype that we need to dispel.
So maybe thank you for saying that, and for honestly just the fresh approach. I feel like so many labor leaders are trying to take a fresh approach. And so let's re-examine some of the assumptions. And maybe I've heard in talking to business leaders, I do hear some horror stories, which we could talk about in a minute. But I'd love to just start with, what does the best version look like? If business and labor get it right, working together, how good can that get?
Yeah, and I think we have some great examples. And my friend Tom Cohen is an expert in this as well, having studied over the course of many years these labor management partnership constructs. The best version is when you have a true, trusted, and respectful collective bargaining relationship. That's where we start in the labor movement. And if you have an employer that is willing to respect that and participate in good faith, that's really good. But it's more than just collective bargaining. It's, after the contract, and, how are you engaging your workforce? How are you using your labor management committees or processes to really bring in those worker voices and perspectives upstream? Because we know often management has a tendency to, oh, we're going to implement something. We've already put it all together, but now it's got to land, and let's bring the workers in and see what they think. We need to flip that on its head. And I'll throw out a couple of examples. Alabama Power. I was just with the CEO a couple of days ago. He came to the holiday party for the building and construction trades because he knew that relationship, if it's trusted, if it's less transactional, frankly, that you're actually getting to know each other as people and spending time together, that benefits him and the way he runs his company. And so their partnership started with safety. Workers were dying on the job. And they said, you know what, we got to do something different here. So they reset, they recalibrated, and now their labor management partnership goes beyond just safety. It's obviously training and some of the baseline, but it's really a deep respect and a level of an engagement upfront, upstream on business decisions. So I think that's when it's working well.
And so, then the trouble, and by the way, I've seen a lot of that too. Today, my job is I'm a venture capitalist. I run Bloomberg's VC firm. When I was a CEO, having a strong single counterparty in my workforce could have enabled us to roll out technological innovations, manage employee issues that come up. And, for everybody who's here, if you have not been to there are at least two labor-run training centers in Las Vegas, and I know there are others around the country, the Carpenters Training Center, the Culinary Academy, these are better training facilities because they work across an industry than anything I've seen any single company do anywhere in the US at least. And so I do want to give some credit, though, not be a Pollyanna, and give some credit to some of the difficult stories, because there are companies that say they try to work with unions and they hit a brick wall. The relationship starts out adversarial on day one. Their operations slow down, even if there's not a work stoppage or a strike. And you hear, like with any big institutions, you hear these horror stories like, well, the union rep told my workers to work less hard. And so I guess I'm looking for some practical wisdom. When companies do hit those inevitable hiccups or horror stories, I mean, there's a whole range. What should they do?
Well, a lot of times the breakdown is over trust, and often at the middle management level. And, where you've had fights along the way, and maybe even miscommunications that turned into, a skepticism that broke that trust level down. So the one thing that comes to mind for me is when things are not working, you just have to take it to the top. And I've seen it before where once you have a meeting with the union leader at the top, the company leader at the top, the CEO, sit down, have a dinner meeting and say, how do we recalibrate? What do we want to accomplish together? Because when we're working together effectively, it's a win-win for everybody. So what do we need to do to show that we're earnest about fixing things? And you'd be surprised, you know, how that can unlock progress. And so that's the one thing concretely that I think can happen, because these breakdowns often occur at a lower level in the chain. And you'll have a manager that just has a terrible way of dealing with people, or a union leader that might have also the same, approach. And then when you get those two top leaders to unlock things and set the standard and say, this is how we're going to do business with each other, that shows the leadership that filters through.
It strikes me that actually that sounds really similar to any partnership between two organizations, and the business leaders that are used to difficult relationships in a merger partnership, in a vendor relationship, that actually applying some of the same skills can work here. And I'll also note, and I want you to, reflect on this a little bit, that some corporate leaders have done some things that might previously have been thought to be unimaginable because of the challenge they'd invite on themselves. And let's pick the example of Microsoft. Microsoft pledged, and maybe you can speak to the specifics of their pledge, but pledged a form of non-opposition to employee organizing efforts. And there were those in the business world who thought, well, if you do something like that, you're just going to put a target on your back. All of a sudden, everybody's going to be unionizing. And so I'm just curious how you see the example of the Microsoft case.
Yeah, and Microsoft took a risk, and it was a bold move to negotiate what we call a neutrality agreement with the Communications Workers of America, CWA, when it applied to new workers that were coming into the company with Activision. So it was a leap of faith. And what Microsoft, Brad Smith in particular, said is, if this is a trend in the country, if workers are rising up and they want to be heard, they want to have a path to bring their voice to the table, and they want to do that through a union, then why should we be adversarial and try and stop them or intimidate them from doing so? And so that's what neutrality is not saying, yes, you should join the union. It's just, we simply as a company will not interfere, which is what we see as the norm across the country.
And what the law requires, presumably.
Yes, there is that. The law is definitely on the worker side in this one, right? But the companies know it's a cost of doing a business now to bust unions. So Microsoft said, we're going to do something different here and, go with what the trend is, where workers want to be a part of the decision-making table, right? They want their voices heard, and we think it could be a positive thing for our company. So I, contrast that with Starbucks, who chose the opposite tact, which is, we're going to fight you every step of the way. We're going to fire people. We're going to make it difficult. And oh, by the way, you unionized, but we're not going to sit at the table in earnest and negotiate a contract. We're going to just delay it as much as we can until we think it loses momentum. So those are the two paths. We think Microsoft's path will ultimately be a competitive advantage, especially as tech is an emerging industry and we know all of the uncertainty. Look at OpenAI, what just happened there, that workers want to know that they're going to have a voice, in the trajectory of how their industry evolves.
And we've got only about 5 minutes left with you. So we have so many AI, plenty of things, but you raised the issue of competitive threat. One thing I hear from business leaders is, I don't want to be working with a union if my competitors are not, because it'll put me at a disadvantage. And I know there are some approaches, industry-wide approaches. Hollywood has an industry-wide approach. California has a new experiment around fast food that we've talked about. What do you say to a corporate leader who says, how can I do this unless my competitors also do the same?
Well, there's two things I would say. One is, let's flip that on its head and acknowledge the possibility that actually you could have more productive.
Might be an advantage.
And it's an advantage, and it's a reputational gain. To be able to say you're a high road employer, that, we as the labor movement can say, don't boycott this company, because this is a company that is working well with their working people. So I think that that's a net positive. But the other thing I would add is, we should be looking more at sectoral approaches, because yes, it is a risk for one company as we know with the autos, right? We have 3 unionized auto firms in and amongst 13 non-union firms. And so how do we get a sectoral approach so that it lifts the tide of all the workers and, of course, makes it less of a competitive question for the companies? And so we think that those collaborations are natural. We've got some industries that are on the ground floor. If you think about chips and science,
Sure.
we can do this right. We can start now, come to an agreement as an industry, and have all of the companies say, let's just do this together and make sure that, you know, we're all paying our workers well and ensuring a good future for
I love that. I mean, as the industries get remade, we have a chance. All right, I'm going to ask you my hardest question now, which is, I've spent a lot of time, as I know you have too, working on the issue of how businesses need to evolve their perspective, get more knowledgeable. We have this piece in Harvard Business Review that we wrote, first one in their magazine on organized labor in 32 years, by the way. It's in the chat. But you lead a federation of unions. How do unions need to change?
Yeah, and we have to acknowledge that, right? We have to look in the mirror. We're not perfect. So we can absolutely, you know, we're talking about that now. You know, this emerging workforce, it's a diverse workforce, and it's going to need different things than, you know, the workforce of yesterday. And so we need to be more dynamic. We need to be more flexible and respond to the changing nature of work and the changing nature of what workers need. And so, you know, taking maybe a more platform approach to how we represent workers, how we use technology, thinking of new models of representation that maybe we haven't thought about before, and acknowledging some of these breakdowns, like you said, where, you know, we come in like a bull in a china shop because we've seen it before, right? We've had bad experiences. So often we travel with that baggage. And so acknowledging that as we move forward, as you know, we're going to see new industries emerge, that we need to be also looking in the mirror and assessing the practices that maybe are outdated and outmoded.
Well,
and
I really
we are open
appreciate
to
that. I really appreciate that. And it's not lost on me that we also have, including you, a much more diverse set of leaders of American unions than we have had at any point in history. Mary Kay Henry at SEIU, you know, many others. And so thank you for that. Okay, last question, because we could go in deep on AI and how we, you know, you cited OpenAI. I think we'll leave some of the discussion of current issues and experiments for the panel that will follow, because I see, by the way, the purpose of this business roundtable in part as enabling experiments. And enabling experiments is the way we figure out what works so we can grow. And so just to ask, when you think about a business group like this, and I know around World War II, there were dozens of American business groups devoted to healthy relationships with organized labor. Now we got the only one. When you see a group like this, what do you hope to see from it in the future?
I think this is an opportunity to set a new expectation. I think this is an opportunity for leadership, because we all know that hard change doesn't happen unless we have leaders who are willing to take it on. So that's why I'm grateful to the leaders who are here today, and to Aspen and MIT and all the partners. I think we're in a moment now where income inequality is still so very stark. You know, we're in a moment where we're recovering from the disinvestment that took place over decades, you know, in manufacturing and other industries, and workers right now, if you haven't noticed, are readying themselves, and they're raising their expectations for themselves and their communities. And so they're putting companies on notice, and they're saying, look, we need value for our work. We're making you successful. So I think it's important that, again, you know, those two paths I outlined, you could be the Starbucks, you could be the Microsoft. And we need more Microsofts, and we need more AT&Ts, and we need more, you know, these firms who have been there with us for so long. And we need to support them and show them what true partnership looks like in this new era going forward into the future.
I love that. Thank you for underlining the issues that workers still face. I see it as a risk, in addition to harm to them. There's just a risk of hysteria and general instability in our economy and society. And we see it in reactions to what's happening in the Middle East. We see it in issues over race, over economic prosperity, all valid issues. And so thank you for being part of the innovative and stabilizing force And thank you, by the way, before I turn back to Liba, to the roughly 36 companies that are part of this business roundtable. Every single one of them is admired by other business leaders, and every single one of them has chosen to do something that is new and intrepid. And so I'm really grateful to my peers who are part of the business roundtable. And thank you, President Schuler, and I'll turn it back over to Liba.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you both, President Schuler and Roy. And now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our panel. I'm just going to put names to faces really quickly because you can find their bios on our webpage. Jamie Barton leads the Global Human Resources and Labor Relations teams at AT&T, which is the only major US telecoms company with a fully union represented workforce. Raj Nayak serves as Assistant Secretary for Policy at the United States Department of Labor. Matt Patsky is CEO of Trillium Asset Management, the oldest independent investment advisor devoted exclusively to sustainable and responsible investing. And Allison von Hardenberg serves as the employee representative on the board of directors at Honeycomb, which is a software company where she works managing a team of engineers. And finally, we're so grateful to have Joe Weisenthal moderating today's conversation. Joe was one of Business Insider's first employees and rose to be its executive editor before coming to Bloomberg, where he was executive editor of Bloomberg Digital for the last 8 years. He co-hosts Bloomberg's Odd Lots podcast, which happens to be one of my personal favorites. I don't know if there are other fans in the audience, but Joe, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Liba, and I'm thrilled to have be here and have this conversation, and aware we have a limited amount of time, so just jump right into it. I'm going to throw out a question that I think can sort of apply to anyone, so maybe someone just turn on their microphone, but we're in this moment. We're talking about labor. There were at least 2 very prominent strikes in the news over the last year between Hollywood and auto, probably several others that didn't get as much attention. How much of this is a function of, in anyone's view, the macroeconomic cycle? Labor markets have been very tight, theoretically conferring upon workers a certain amount of bargaining power that they wouldn't get when unemployment rate is higher. How much of what we're talking about right now, the fact that we're all here, the fact that we've seen all this activity, is simply a function of a certain moment in the macro cycle that may not be here forever?
I can jump in if that's okay.
Please.
I do think, Jamie, AT&T, I do think that, I don't think it's a flash in the pan. I think this younger generation, and we see it at our company, they've grown up with technology. They don't remember a world before the smartphone. And their expectation is not only to be heard, but they demand a response. And I think the collective bargaining process, the unions, organized labor in general, I believe puts a sense of urgency into that process that's not going to go away anytime soon or ever. And I think that's probably healthy because sometimes it's a long way from the corporate offices to the frontline deskless workers, certainly at our company and others. And I think having the union representatives along with management that are closest to the customers, having that voice and having that point of view is important. We think it's good for business as well, but that's why I think that some of what we're seeing right now is here to stay.
Anyone else, Matt?
Well, I was going to say, I would agree with Jamie. There is a generational shift that is absolutely, I would say, more pro-union and also much more, has much higher expectations of what they expect from their employers. We did come out of a global pandemic, which greatly reduced immigration patterns. Also, the boom coming out of COVID left everyone under, basically we were tight labor markets are happening across all industries across the board. And so it was a moment in time in which I think there was the ability to get a lot more traction on bringing labor as a key asset of companies operations needing to share in the prosperity of what was happening, because obviously we know for decades labor was being undervalued and wasn't getting their full wasn't sharing in that prosperity.
Maybe just to move this forward, Raj, obviously this administration has been extraordinarily pro-union. I think some of the overtures made to organized labor have been almost unprecedented, unheard of. On this point, though, how much is getting that econ component, from your perspective, getting that correct so that we do just have a robust economy, so that there is demand for workers? How important is that to the overall strategy of what it even means to be a sort of pro-labor administration?
Thanks, Joe. And just want to say thank you all for having us here. This is a really exciting conversation. I mean, like you said, it's no surprise this administration supports unions. President Biden's been really upfront about that, not only in words, but actually joining a picket line in Michigan, which I think is what you were talking about as one of the unprecedented steps taken. But as we all know, there are employers who are concerned about unions. We hear that. But we've heard from employers who are more concerned throughout this entire administration about hiring qualified workers and retaining them. That's the number one thing we hear.
Yeah.
The job market isn't as hot now as it once was. But over the past few years, as we've been talking about, there have been major changes in the workplace, and employers and workers alike are still trying to figure out how to navigate those. So, to your point, 67% in the recent Gallup poll of workers approved unions. There's another survey from a couple of years ago that surveyed 4,000 workers and found that 52% of non-union workers want to form a union. And that was before, some of these high-profile deals like the UAW, UPS, the SAG-AFTRA deals more recently. But according to BLS data, just take a step back, only 6% of private sector workers are actually in unions. So one theme we're hearing today already, and I suspect we'll hear more of, is that employers who have union work sites can take advantage of that mismatch. If you're looking to recruit workers, and more importantly, retain the workers you've got and grow your business, you have the opportunity to get out in front of everyone else and embrace worker voice. It can make working for you really attractive for the workers you're trying to recruit. And as we're seeing more and more, that can be in computer programming, manufacturing, retail, and otherwise. So I saw, as President Schuler was suggesting earlier, that's a competitive advantage in this labor market. And whether you're hiring across those industries, it's a great way to set yourself apart.
I'm so glad you brought that angle up because that is anticipating where I was going to go next, which is that, one of the big problems over the last couple of years, of course, is employers frustrated with churn and hiring and so forth. Allison, I want to bring you in. What in your view should companies understand about when they're thinking about retaining workers, hiring workers, what having labor representation, having unions can mean in terms of employee retention, employee attraction?
Yeah, so at Honeycomb, we're not unionized, but I am on the board of directors. I am an employee, and we elected someone to be our employee representative on that board of directors. And as such, I have a fiduciary responsibility to help Honeycomb be successful. It's not labor representation, but we have a voice at the table and we're in the room where it happens. And that is really attractive to people who come to look for working for us. We see it at our director level, VP level, just having that transparency between like the board of directors, which tends to be a more closed off conversation, and the frontline people who work at Honeycomb. It just sort of is it's put in place some policy for that clear level of communication. And that has really added to employee retention and hiring.
Jamie, do you want to come in on this question too about like what it means to have the advantage of a unionized workforce in a time when many companies are sort of tearing their hairs out about churn?
Yeah, absolutely. It does help us recruit the best workers, more experienced workers, and our employees stay with us longer, which is just a virtuous cycle. Absolutely. But when the labor market gets tight, just like any company, we also saw an increase in churn or attrition. But the thing that helped us, because we have a close partnership with the unions that are partners with AT&T, that gave us an easy way to tap in to the frontline employees and figure out why. We could just reach out to our partners at a IBEW and say, hey, we're seeing attrition in Wisconsin. It's just, it's above the norm. It's everybody's on the up, right? Is up and to the right. But this particular area, we're really struggling. And we didn't have to bring in consultants and spend money on research. We just reached out to our union partners there, and they could say, here's who's hiring in the market. Here's what's happening in the workplace. You changed out middle management, right? And those are just examples, and we can get to the heart of it really, really quickly because of our partnership with the unions. And many of our managers also were previous members of the unions, and it really keeps, we're geographically dispersed, we're everywhere, we're a big company, and it really helps us get to what's happening on the front line much quicker than if we didn't have that partnership and those lines of communication open. So that's a benefit we see.
That's incredibly interesting. It's funny, literally an hour before this, we recorded an episode of the podcast that'll be out next week with the co-founder of a restaurant chain. He was talking about, having to do a listening tour of sorts with employees, but that makes a ton of sense that you have 1 or 2 phone calls to make and you can sort of get access to that information rapidly. Let's go back, Allison and Matt, to this conversation about other models or employee representation on the board, because I do think intuitively that feels like an attractive idea to a lot of people in terms of getting alignment right so that everyone is on to something of a sense of the same team. Allison, maybe just start, why don't you talk a little bit more about like how it specifically works at your firm?
Yeah, so at Honeycomb, we'll have an employee board member sit on the board of directors for 2 years, attend all the board meetings. I have a full vote in the boardroom. So when it comes to voting, I am like fully counted in that. And it was really important for us to establish this norm in times that were good. So things were going well, our like sales were going well. And we wanted to make sure that was in place so that when times are bad, it's already there, that trust is built. Those sort of patterns of attending board meetings, sharing back to employees at our all-hand meetings are already there. And there's that trust between our executive staff and our board members and our employees.
Matt, from the investor perspective, from the outside perspective, what do you think? Talk to us your view on some of these arrangements, or what more could be done with some of these arrangements. Well,
employees participating on the board is absolutely a great thing we look for and appreciate. We just at Trillium, we have 5 board members of Trillium, and 3 of them are employees. So we have there's lots of participation for employees on the board, but employee ownership is a critical factor. And is something we've seen where it ties employees both in terms of loyalty and lowering turnover has worked very effectively. So the original, we have to sort of step back while we are obviously very aggressively pressing Starbucks to change behavior around unions now. That when they started, they had come out with a program of broad employee ownership, healthcare benefits for part-time employees. They had come at it from the perspective of treating their employees much better than the traditional coffee shop had, and that's why they had great success. I think in the early days was they had a model of including the employees in a lot of the thought processes of how to structure the business, and so that is always helpful. I mean, certainly. Trade unions have played an incredible role in the success of, UPS as an example of a larger company, where employee ownership has been tied also with there's the labor, having been unionized. But so seeing that in combination, I think is probably the most powerful tool for attracting talent and retention.
Okay, so it's all great, and it's good for retention. It's good for knowing, reducing churn and getting alignment. But obviously, there's a lot of skepticism some spectrum of skepticism to hostility among a wide swath of companies. Raj, going back to you, like what is from the perspective of the administration? Obviously, I'm sure you hear companies express frustration. What are the biggest concerns that they have, or what makes them upset? What are the downsides that they see most starkly from your perspective?
Joe, I was thinking about what Allison said a few minutes ago about like the importance of starting at the good times and like getting that relationship built. And also a little bit of what President Schuler was saying earlier, and Roy talking about some of the, kind of horror stories out there. One thing we think about is, and I'd say for the business leaders on this call, I don't have to tell you that running a business is complicated, right? Sometimes there are just questions where there's no right answer. It definitely feels like, to me at least, there's more uncertainty out there today than there was before. We've seen everything from like hopefully a once in a generation pandemic to the need to plan around the climate crisis and everything else that's going on today. So we think of the bargaining table as a great place to actually hash this out with workers. You give workers voices in the conversation. You get their buy-in on solutions to the hardest problems. You have a forum for tackling the small problems before they become the big problems. We had an event at the Labor Department last week with Secretary Sue in conversation with business and labor leaders, including some of the folks here. And there, the AFL-CIO's senior advisor, Cindy Estrada, made this really good point. She said, I've never seen a worker join a union because they hate their job. If you can put workers at the bargaining table, if you get their skin in the game, they don't want to bankrupt their employer. They want to be partners in seeking solutions. Roy was saying this a little bit too, having someone who was a partner in finding the next step. And sometimes there's an opportunity to work through those really intractable problems. We've seen this in 2020 in Europe. We saw, a place where there is more of a culture of worker representation over time. We saw examples of employers and workers really teaming up to say, what do we do about this COVID-19 thing? When no one had actual answers, right? We didn't quite know yet. I don't know if we'll ever know exactly what we should have done, but it's people getting around the table and saying, okay, how do we balance these risks? How do we get people to work in the safest way possible? And you know what, if we made the right choice, or the wrong choice, we were all in this together anyway.
Matt, just going back to you for a moment. Again, it's all great when people can find some solutions. And so the workers feel better. Maybe they get more pay. Maybe they get more representation. The management sees lower churn, better insight, more attractive place to work, et cetera. But there must be some situations in which it truly is, there's a pie, and one side gets, there's the shareholders and there's labor. Right. And if labor gets more, then on some level, shareholders are going to get less. How should management think about those situations where acceding to some of the goals of labor may just mean, less profit or less margin at the end of the day?
Yeah, I would argue that that's just short-termism. And what we really need to do is think about long-term sustainability of business models. And we did have at Trillium, we put out a white paper that I would point people toward called the Investor Case for Supporting Worker Organizing Rights. And it basically goes through this, which is, why is it that over time we think there's actually going to be better outcomes for shareholders if they're acknowledging the right to unionize, if they're acknowledging the truth, which is what is the most critical asset every company works with day in and day out? It's people. And if you haven't recognized that, you're starting off like with a major problem. And when we obviously went through decades of, I think there being an effort to cut costs across the board, particularly labor costs, and we're now in an environment in which that has, that people need to be more focused on valuing and properly treating their most valuable asset.
Jamie, maybe you can come in on this question. I mean, the fact that AT&T has such a unionized workforce. Can you talk a little bit further about how the nature of that relationship would be different if it weren't unionized, and what some of the pluses and minuses of that are?
Well, I like to think that we would treat everyone the same as we do today. But I will tell you that I know I sleep better at night knowing that we have the collective bargaining agreements at our foundation, given how geographically dispersed we are, Given we are in stores, customer care, trucks and garages in people's homes every day, hundreds and hundreds of times a day. I like knowing that we have that system of checks and balances, if you will, and it starts in fairness, right? So fairness when it comes to wages, fairness when it comes to scheduling, fairness when it comes to access to training and opportunity to maybe earn more and take on more responsibility within the union ranks. Those collective bargaining agreements and the union members out in the field, as we like to say, make sure that fairness standard is in place and recognized every day. And without it, I think we'd have to put a lot more management overhead, honestly, in place to make sure that those standards were upheld. That is what I'm a former union member myself. That's where I started my career at Southwestern Bell back in the day. Now AT&T, of course. But that's why I'm proud to work at AT&T and why I relish our relationship with the unions, is because it's a level playing field. When you start at this company and you're represented by the union, you know that you have just as much access to the next job, the next opportunity, the next increase, the next best schedule as anyone else. So that's how I think. Without it, I think we'd have to spend a lot more time making sure that was in place. And with the collective bargaining agreements, I think we almost take it for granted a little bit at AT&T, especially those of us that have been here for a little while.
I want to talk more about organized labor, unions, labor bargaining power in the context of sort of new and changing business models. Going back to you, Allison, obviously people saw, and it was in the conversation before, the incredible power of workers with the OpenAI drama and the threat of every worker threatening to quit if they didn't bring back the CEO. Obviously, in the software context, there are opportunities for workers who can make life-changing amounts of money if they strike gold at the right company with stock options and an IPO, et cetera. When it comes, and of course, we know that even in downturns, there's just incredibly fierce competitions for talent and brutal competitions for talent that seem to always be the case, especially if it's cutting edge talent and so forth. Talk a little bit more about, in the software context, what we should know about labor relations and retention in such a cutthroat industry for talent.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring up the OpenAI piece, because when that was going on in our internal chat conversation at work, someone was like, this is why we have an employee board representative. We have someone there who, if this were to happen at Honeycomb, we would know about it. We would have a voice already there, and it probably wouldn't happen in the same way. With regards to like the employee investment in the company, in tech, especially in venture-backed startups, most employees get some sort of options or shares in the company as part of their compensation. So they come into the company from day one having investment in the company. And that kind of changes the way I think that people think about staying at a company, how long they might stay. There's usually a vesting cliff for those options. And that's baked into a lot of the way that hiring happens in tech, venture-backed tech specifically. When it comes to hiring, when I run a hiring panel for my team, we often talk about the employee board member role and how it's already in place. Employees have that path to the executives, and people react really, really well to it. A lot of my peers have said they stay at Honeycomb because they can't find that kind of culture elsewhere in tech. Leaders come to Honeycomb because of that same thing. The values are baked into the way we run our company.
Roger, another aspect of business models, and maybe this was something that people were talking about a little bit more a few years ago, but I don't think it's really changing, is just that, gig work et cetera, is going to be one of these areas where not only is there not unionization, there's still ongoing fights about the classification of workers, whether they're employees at all, et cetera. What are you working on, or what is your administration or your bureau working on in terms of bringing more sort of thinking about the pro-labor stance in the context of some of these different labor arrangements?
Yeah, no, so this is, I think one of the realities is, as you're saying, there are all kinds of new relationships between workers and business around the country in various ways. We're of course always interested in mainly the question of whether workers who are employees are being misclassified as independent contractors. But to your point, like really all of this, we take a step back and think about that broad new playbook. And what are the benefits to employers of for example, even pledging neutrality or voluntarily recognizing their workers in various ways?
Yeah.
One thing we've been thinking about in terms of labor management relations is an employer who pledges neutrality can also help set negotiations on a more productive and collaborative path, so you can refocus your attention on those real issues. We're not always going to agree, but neutrality can really help set the tone for productive conversations.
So we just have a few minutes left. I mean, we started this conversation talking about, okay, well, it's a tight labor market. Just this morning, a couple hours ago, I found out that the unemployment rate fell back to 3.7%, which is awesome. But in theory, probably almost for certain, there will be another a downturn, and layoffs will pick up. And maybe Allison, you talked about the importance of establishing these relationships in good times, when it may be easier to build trust, when the money is more flowing. But how do people thinking, and maybe I'll go around, about at some point, some companies, there may be another layoff cycle, and some of that trust may have to be spent, or there's a reason you build up that trust because it's needed in the difficult times. How are people thinking about these relationships when it gets leaner?
For us, it's really important that it doesn't come as a surprise. It's true, layoffs happen in tech, they're happening almost daily.
Yeah.
But knowing, like, being able to see it coming and have that clear communication early on so people can be prepared, support people through layoffs, I think that's a really important piece of it. At Honeycomb, we often share, like, we know when our zero cash date is. We know how sales are. We see those numbers quarterly at our all hands meetings. I share them from the board meetings with our employees. They know how the company's doing. And because we all have this sort of vested interest in the company, we all really want it to be successful. Sometimes that means layoffs, and it is awful for the individuals going through those layoffs, but it does help if they know that it's coming. They can prepare themselves. They can start working on their resumes, getting those connections made.
Jamie, maybe you could talk about it, because obviously AT&T has seen many cycles up and down, and so talk a little bit about what you see as the advantage of having a good labor relationship throughout the cycle.
Sure. It definitely, it's a lot better when we're hiring and growing and spending money and expanding the fiber network. That's for sure. Things are a lot easier. We do have downturns, obviously. We have letting people be surprised, as Allison said, is very, very important. And we do have job security provisions in all of our collective bargaining agreements. And when we see it coming, we spend a lot of time up front, because we've invested, time and money in training people. So if we can place them somewhere else in a different job, different title, different geography, that's our first step. And we do a pretty good job, really, of placing people. If customer care work is going away, then we try to put people in the stores, or vice versa. We have training programs where I myself was a customer service agent, and I took a training program and became a technician. So those types of things are still in place at AT&T. So that's the first thing we do. We also have project-driven work, and we do have temporary employees, specifically in the network side of the house, the people that are building our fiber network. And we know those jobs are cyclical. We're going to build it, and then we're in and we're out. And those temporary workers, they know that they're temporary. They know that the project will come to an end. But those are also they're also members of our unions, and so they pay dues and are represented just like everyone else. So that allows us to smooth it out a little bit, and those folks know that they're on a assignment with an end in sight. So that, I think, sets expectations and allows us to be transparent about the ebbs and flows in the market and the work that we do.
Final couple of minutes, Matt, from the investor perspective, what more, I'm sure there are a lot of investors who are sort of interested in many of these topics, and especially as you say that there really is long-term benefits. What are the main maybe tools, wedges, mechanisms that investors can play? Are there other models? I mean, we talked about unionization, we've talked about board representation, obviously shareholder employee equity ownership of the company. Are there other things that people should be thinking of in terms of just improving employee-employer relationships from the investor perspective?
Yeah. The investors, particularly large institutional players, need to always remember they are the owners of the company. And it is really critical that they make sure their voice is being heard and that they understand the complexity of the relationship of the labor relations and the importance of the labor force in the operation and sustainability of any business. And so far too many investors and far too large a percentage of the total ownership is completely silent on all issues. Right. It's active, passive managed, the passive running of portfolios is one thing, but to be a passive owner is to abdicate your fiduciary duty of engaging with the companies you own. And it is inexcusable, in my humble opinion, and a violation of fiduciary duty. And so this is an important issue. It's been demonstrated to be very critical for the sustainability of business models. And so, the investors broadly need to be engaged in trying to encourage certainly more models with employee ownership component, but also just simply the recognition of, as I've said before, the most valuable asset almost every company happens to have is its people, right? So to ignore that is just irresponsible.
Well, there's obviously tons more we could talk about, but I think given the time, that is a great note to go out on. So Jamie, Allison, Matt, and Raj, thank you so much. That was a great chat, and I'll hand it back to Liba.
Wow, thank you so much, Joe. Thank you, Allison, Jamie, Matt, and Raj. And thank you, Tom and Roy and President Schuler, for this really terrific discussion. We squeezed a lot into a short time. You all shared what you're trying out in employee governance, in collaboration with unions. We know other roundtable members are also innovating in employee ownership, shared HR management, AI, other deployment of technology, and more. You all reminded us that a strong legacy of worker organizing in this country helped to create a social contract between employers and workers in that period after World War II. And as our society and economy have transformed, that contract has frayed. Today, a new generation of workers are organizing to repair it, and they need a partner in business. So we will keep growing the membership of the Aspen Business Roundtable on Organized Labor and deepening our offering to companies. In the new year, we will be sharing some specific actions companies can take in the form of a new actual playbook, which will include reviews of research and new case studies, including the voices and stories of some of the folks you heard here today. We believe that through efforts like these, businesses can remove an obstacle to the thriving of American workers, and that in turn will strengthen our economy, society, and democracy. I'm so grateful to my colleagues at the Aspen Institute and MIT for their support on this event, and generally including Maureen Conway, Matt Helmer, Martha Mangelsdorf, Francis Almodovar, Nora Heffernan, and Tony Mastria. And thank you so much to you, our audience, for joining and sharing your questions and comments. Please do take a moment to give us feedback in that quick survey that will pop up when you exit the Zoom. We hope you'll join the Economic Opportunities Program for its next event, How Benefits Make Jobs Better. which is January 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern, and it will be a hybrid in-person in DC and on Zoom. So we hope to see you then. Thank you so much.